The chamber was never quiet. Not really. 600 delegates from 41 species filled the curved tiers of the Galactic Council chamber on Kel-Saraf Station, and at any given moment, at least 3 of them were arguing, 4 of them were filing motions, and 2 of them were asleep in the way their species slept, eyes open, bodies stiff, dreaming things that had no translation. The session had been running for 9 hours. They had covered the Solari trade dispute, 3 hours, no resolution, tabled for the 14th consecutive session. They had covered the Morvani's request for expanded relay station rights along the outer spiral. They had covered a noise complaint filed by the Jeth Collective against the Vreth Dominion's military exercises in contested space. The noise complaint had taken 40 minutes. Then the notification came. It arrived the way all standard notifications arrived, a small amber light on the chamber aide's console. Low priority. The aide, a young Keth named Torin, who had worked council sessions for 4 years and had developed the professional reflexes of someone who had seen everything at least twice, glanced at it, noted the source, and passed the data chip to the senior aide beside him, without breaking stride. Passed it up the chain. By the time it reached Ambassador Sereth Vel, the chamber had already moved on to the next agenda item, a dispute over asteroid mineral rights in the Belith system, and 2 delegates were on their feet, talking loudly over each other in the way that species with multiple vocal cords always talked when they were annoyed. Sereth Vel was 412 years old. She had sat in this chamber through 3 full council restructurings, 11 changes in session protocol, and the slow institutional drift that made a body built to govern the galaxy look on most days like a very large committee that had forgotten what it was supposed to be deciding. She read the notification once. Then she read it again. The Vreth Dominion had formally declared war on the human territories. She set the data chip down on her station surface, picked up her water, took one slow sip, set it down. Around her, the asteroid mineral rights dispute continued. This was not, on its face, unusual. The Vreth Dominion had declared war 14 times in the last 2 centuries. They had won all 14. They were methodical about it. Formal declaration, rapid advance, controlled defeat of the target species, followed by an equally formal peace treaty that left the Vreth with exactly what they had wanted before the war began. The whole process was, in its way, almost polite. A demonstration more than a destruction. No one had ever beaten them. Not the Solari, who had the 2nd largest fleet in the council. Not the Jeth Collective, whose distributed consciousness had been considered a tactical advantage until the Vreth proved otherwise. Not the Belith, who hired mercenaries from 6 different species and still lost in 30 days. 6 centuries, no losses, no draws, no surprises. The Vreth were not cruel. They were simply very, very good. And humanity, provisional members of the Galactic Council for 18 months, classified as a Category 3 emergent species, pre-stellar empire, limited fleet, no standing military alliances, was, on paper, the easiest target the Vreth had ever chosen. The official paperwork called humans promising. Everyone who had visited the human territories called them interesting, in the way you called something interesting when you did not yet have a more precise word. The Vreth had done their research. The Vreth always did their research. Across the chamber, Councillor Preth sat very still. The Morvani were a quiet species. Their collective consciousness, 6 billion minds joined in a single shared awareness, made individual speech feel redundant most of the time. Why talk when the thought was already shared? Preth attended council sessions as his people's representative, which meant he spent most sessions in a state of mild internal division, half present in the chamber and half dissolved into the warm hum of his species' shared awareness, 40 light-years away. He felt the shift in Sereth Vel before he read the notification himself. Her stillness had a quality, not the stillness of someone waiting, the stillness of someone who had received information, and was being careful about what she did with her face. He read the notification. He did not open the Human Historical Archive. Not yet. He filed the thought away and watched the chamber continue its work. Around him, 41 species argued and debated and filed things and slept with their eyes open. Nobody had noticed that Sereth Vel had put down her water and not picked it up again. He noticed. The notification was added to the official council record at 11:42 Standard Time. It was the third item logged that session. The formal response protocol for a Category 3 conflict was well established. Council observers would be assigned to the region. A humanitarian aid framework would be drafted. A timeline buffer of 6 months would be set aside for conflict resolution, after which mediation would be formally offered. 6 months was standard. 6 months was, in fact, generous. The Belith War had lasted 30 days. The Solari engagement before that, 11 weeks. 6 months assumed a level of fight from the human territories that, based on everything on record, they were unlikely to demonstrate. Aid Torin began drafting the humanitarian aid review. He scheduled it 5 months and 3 weeks out, which was how you said 6 months when you wanted to look organized. He was halfway through the form when he noticed something in the Vreth declaration he had missed on the first read. He almost flagged it. Then he decided it was probably standard language. He had only been working sessions for 4 years. There was a lot of standard language he did not yet recognize. He saved the form and moved on. Sereth Vel had caught it on her first read. It was a single line, buried in the declaration's third appendix, under a section titled Operational Parameters and Observational Rights Requests. Standard Vreth War Doctrine included an optional clause, a formal request for Council observer access to the conflict zone, for purposes of historical record. The Vreth liked their victories documented. It was not vanity. It was, in their framework, professional discipline. A record of how they fought and how they won, so the record could be studied, refined, passed down. They requested observation rights when they expected a significant engagement. They had never requested observation rights for a Category 3 conflict. Not once. Not in 6 centuries. Category 3 conflicts were resolved before the observers could file their travel paperwork. She read the line a third time. Request Council observation rights for historical record. She opened her personal archive and created a new flag. A 400-year-old habit. The habit of a woman who had watched too many things get dismissed as standard language, and watched those things become the only things that mattered. She typed 2 words into the notation field. Monitor closely. Around her, the mineral rights dispute ground toward a reluctant compromise. Someone proposed a partition. Someone else rejected the partition. A third delegate suggested they table it. There was procedural murmuring. A vote was called. Sereth Vel did not vote on the mineral rights dispute. She was still reading the flag she had just created, and beneath it, she was doing the quiet arithmetic of a very old woman who had learned that the things you almost missed were always the things you should have caught first. The water sat untouched on her station surface. The session moved forward. The Council filed its forms. On the other side of the galaxy, the Vreth Dominion's engagement fleet positioned itself at the edge of human territory and prepared to do what it had always done. Nobody in the chamber was particularly worried, except for the woman who had lived long enough to know that the Vreth did not request observers for wars they expected to be easy. She had never, in 400 years, seen them request observers for an easy war. The first data feed from the front arrived at 0347 Standard Time. The Council's automated monitoring array caught it, tagged it as a Category 3 conflict update, and routed it to the standard observation queue. 17 other minor territorial conflicts were producing similar updates. The system processed them all the same way. Flag, sort, archive. Nobody needed to look at any of them in real time. Someone looked at this one in real time, at 0412. By 0428, it had been escalated twice. By 0441, the main chamber display was live with the Vreth engagement feed. The mineral rights debate had stopped. The Sulari trade dispute delegates had gone quiet. 41 species sat in their seats and watched positional telemetry data do something it had never done before in any conflict this chamber had ever monitored. The Vreth fleet was not advancing, not destroyed, not ambushed, not retreating. Stopped. Completely still, mid-formation, in open space, like a machine that had been handed instructions it could not process and had simply paused while it tried to figure out what to do next. War Master Don Krog commanded the engagement force from his flagship, the Undeniable. He had commanded it for 60 years. He was, by any fair measure, one of the finest military minds the Vreth Dominion had produced in the last 3 centuries. And the Dominion had been producing fine military minds for 600 years. He had seen, in those 60 years, every way a civilization could fight. The Vreth doctrine was built on a simple truth. A species goes to war the way its history made it. Its fear, its psychology, its resources, its losses, all of it gets pressed into the shape of how it fights. Watch the first engagement. Identify the profile. The Vreth had documented 9 distinct tactical profiles across 14 wars, and had counters for all of them, including the hybrid combinations. They had never needed more than the first engagement to see which one they were dealing with. The engagement force had hit the human outer perimeter at 0300 standard. Standard doctrine: show force, probe response, assess. The human response came in 40 seconds. Don Krog's tactical AI processed it, then processed it again, then returned a result he had never seen in 60 years of command. Profile: unclassified. He overrode the AI and looked at the data himself. He looked at it for a long time. The human response to the probe did not match any of the 9 profiles. It did not match any documented hybrid. It was not defensive. It was not a standard counterattack. It was not a withdrawal pattern or a feint. At a structural level, it resembled 3 different profiles simultaneously, except those 3 profiles contradicted each other at the tactical level. You could not execute all 3 at once. The logic of war did not allow it. You chose one. That was how every civilization that had ever fought had fought. The human response had somehow managed to be wrong in 3 directions at the same time. And it had worked. The probe force had not been destroyed. It had been confused. There was a difference, and Don Krog sat with the difference for a long time. Because confusion was not a tactical outcome he had a name for. Confusion was not in the doctrine. Confusion was what happened to you before you lost, and it was supposed to resolve quickly into one of the 9 known patterns as the enemy showed its hand. The hand was not showing. He told the fleet to hold. He sent a transmission to Vreth High Command. 3 words. The Council's translation system rendered them as, recalibrate. They're improvising. In the Council chamber, the feed updated every 4 minutes. The Vreth fleet held, then held some more. The Sulari representative, a woman named Velaresh, who had been in diplomatic service for 30 years, and had what her staff privately called the best read in the room, leaned forward in her chair, and did not lean back. She had been present during the last Vreth engagement, the one against the Beleth. She had watched that feed too. The Vreth had been advancing within 12 minutes of first contact. They had not held. They had never held. 48 minutes. She pulled up the historical engagement records on her secondary display and checked the longest documented Vreth tactical pause in any of the 14 prior conflicts. 17 minutes, against the Jeth Collective. Year 412. She closed the records. 3 seats down, Sareth Fell was watching the live feed with an expression that gave away nothing, which was itself a kind of information to anyone who had known her long enough. At 0501 standard, a transmission was logged from the human command station. Not from a ship. From the station itself. A facility so small that the Vreth intelligence brief had listed it as a secondary support installation and assigned it no tactical priority whatsoever. Admiral Yara Solis had sent her first communication of the conflict. The Council's translation AI, a system that processed 6,000 languages simultaneously, including 4 that had been considered untranslatable until 12 years ago, received the transmission and went to work. It took 40 seconds. In context, it had never taken more than 3 seconds on any prior transmission. The result came back with a flag attached. Confidence, 31%. 11 words. Best approximation. They flinched. Good. Keep making them flinch. Rotate everything. The chamber read it. Nobody spoke. Then the Sulari representative said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "What does she mean by rotate?" Nobody answered her. Sareth Vel read the 11 words 4 times. She was not stuck on rotate. She understood rotate well enough. What she was stuck on was flinch. The choice of that word, the specific weight of it. A flinch was not a tactical response. A flinch was a reflex, an involuntary thing. You did not write doctrine around making your enemy flinch. You wrote doctrine around defeating your enemy's doctrine. Unless you did not have doctrine yourself. Unless you were doing something else entirely. She opened a secondary file and began pulling up every record the Council had on human military engagements. There were not many. Humanity had been a provisional member for 18 months. Their military history, prior to Council contact, was documented in the standard Category 3 intake files. A brief overview, a population estimate, a resource map, a conflict history summary. The conflict history summary was 3 pages long. She opened it, closed it, opened the full archive it was summarizing. The full archive was not 3 pages. She sat with that for a moment. Then she flagged the archive for Preth, because Preth species experienced memory differently, and she wanted to know what someone with a collective historical consciousness made of a species that had apparently been at war with itself on a continuous basis for as long as anyone had been keeping records. She sent the flag, said nothing aloud, went back to the live feed. The Vreth fleet was still holding. At 0533, Don Cross sent a second transmission to High Command. The translation AI returned it in 6 seconds. Confidence, 71%. Their decisions get worse under pressure. Then they adjust. Then the new decisions are worse in different ways. We cannot predict the adjustments. Sareth Vel read it twice. Put it next to the 11 words. They flinched. Keep making them flinch. Rotate everything. She understood now what Solis meant by rotate. She did not find the understanding comforting. The capitulation transmission arrived at 0521 Standard Time. That detail would later cause confusion in the official records, because 0521 was not 5 hours after the conflict began. It was 5 hours and 21 minutes. 3 different council archivists would argue over whether the correct phrasing was 5 hours or 5.5 hours. And the argument would continue for several months before someone pointed out that arguing about 21 minutes was the least relevant thing that had happened that day. The transmission was formal, correct in every procedural respect. The language matched the Council's standard capitulation framework exactly. The Vreth were meticulous about forms, even when the content of the form was a thing they had never once filed in 6 centuries. There was one deviation from the standard framework. The capitulation was not addressed to the human government. It was not addressed to Admiral Yara Solis or the Human Military Command. It was addressed to the Galactic Council. 3 junior aides spent 12 minutes searching for the correct intake form. There was not one. The standard capitulation intake form assumed a minimum 7-day cooling period after a formal declaration of cessation. A field for the date the declaration was issued, a field for the projected date of treaty negotiations, and a field for observer assignments. There was no field for a conflict that had lasted 5 hours and 21 minutes, because the form had been designed by people who had never needed one. The senior aide told them to use the General Correspondence Intake Form and note the nature of the document in the subject field. She said it with the controlled voice of a person who was aware that she was doing something historically unprecedented and had decided that the only appropriate response was to do it correctly. The form was filed at 0548. The visual connection to the Vreth flagship was established at 0601. Don Krog appeared on the main chamber display. He was 6 centuries of military tradition, standing very still. His posture was correct. His expression was the expression of someone who had decided, before opening the channel, exactly what expression he was going to have, and was holding it in place through an act of will that the watching delegates could almost see the shape of. He had requested to speak to the council directly, because, he said, protocol required a recognized senior mediating authority to receive a formal capitulation in a conflict where the prevailing party was a provisional member. This was technically true. It was also true that the alternative was transmitting the capitulation directly to humanity, and he had not done that. He did not address this. He reported what had happened. The chamber listened without interruption. The Sulari representative, who had been leaning forward since 0441, did not change her posture. Pref sat with his hands flat on his station surface. Sereth Vel watched the screen. The report, condensed. The Vreth tactical AI had filed 47 unclassified engagement flags in 5 hours, more than it had filed in any prior conflict combined. Every time it identified a human tactical pattern, the pattern changed, not into another of the 9 known profiles, but into something new, something the AI had no framework for. After the 3rd consecutive flag, Don Craw had ordered his senior staff to attempt manual classification. They had spent 2 hours attempting it. They had failed. The fleet had not been defeated by superior firepower. They had not been outgunned. They had not been outmaneuvered in any way the doctrine had a word for. They had been made to feel that they did not know what was about to happen next. For 43 combined years of command experience spread across his senior staff, men and women who had served in 4 different wars, who had trained on 6 centuries of accumulated military doctrine, who had never in their careers felt that specific feeling. It had been enough. The undeniable could not fight an enemy it could not model. An enemy it could not model was not something the Vreth had ever needed to plan for. They had not planned for it. When the report was complete, Don Krog was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had one additional matter. He would like the council to relay a question to Admiral Solis. The chamber was a room full of species that had developed the professional habit of not reacting. And this was being tested more severely today than it had been in recent memory. But the habit held. The question, transmitted, translated, relayed. Did she know going into the engagement that her own tactics would not work? Did she plan to improvise from the beginning? Sarath Vel sent it to the human command station without comment. The response came back in 40 seconds. The translation AI processed it instantly. No delay, no confidence flag, 100%. 4 words. Why wouldn't I? Don Krog read the 4 words on his own display. The chamber on the council side could see the moment he read them, not because his expression changed, but because the thing holding his expression in place relaxed slightly. The way a mechanism relaxes when it has been running at full load and is allowed finally to stop. He said, "I see." He closed the channel. The council chamber did not erupt. There was no chaos, no overlapping voices, no species-specific expressions of alarm. That came later. What happened immediately was a silence that lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. A collective pause that said more clearly than words could that every person in the room was doing the same arithmetic, and arriving at the same place and needing a moment before they were ready to say it aloud. Sarath Vel looked at the 4 words on her display. Why wouldn't I? She had been in this chamber for a very long time. She had watched civilizations negotiate, collapse, rebuild, and negotiate again. She had watched species that thought they were the most powerful thing in their region of space encounter something they had not anticipated, and she had watched what that did to them. The way certainty, once cracked, did not seal back cleanly. She had never watched it happen to the Vreth. She had not expected to find it as difficult to witness as it was. The Vreth were not cruel. They had built their dominance through discipline and precision, and 6 centuries of being better at this than everyone else. Don Krog was not a bad man. He was a man who had been handed a framework that had always worked, and who had operated inside it faithfully, and who had just encountered the first thing in 6 centuries that the framework could not hold. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the way she had felt 11 times before, in 11 different crises, watching the universe demonstrate that it was larger than the category systems built to describe it. She pulled up the emergency session request Preth had filed 2 hours ago. She confirmed it. Then she looked at the chamber. 41 species, 600 delegates, the body that was supposed to make decisions about how the galaxy governed itself. And she began, quietly, to think about what came next. Because the war was over. The war had been over for 39 minutes. The emergency session was called for 0700 standard. By 0643, every seat was filled. That did not happen often. Full attendance required delegates to cancel other obligations, pull staff from scheduled briefings, and in 3 cases arrange emergency travel across the station. Because several council members had retreated to their private quarters when the conflict ended and had not yet returned. They returned now. They came quickly. They sat down without the usual settling-in period, the side conversations, the document arranging, the quiet negotiating of small things before the large things began. Nobody arranged documents. The session was called to order at 0701. The presiding officer, a Keth administrator named Ren Salath, who had run council sessions for 22 years, and had the voice of someone who had learned to project calm the way a medic learns to project calm, as a tool, deliberately, because the alternative is worse, stated the matter before the chamber. 3 motions were on the table. The first, reclassify humanity as a Category 1 military power, grant immediate full council membership, begin alliance framework negotiations. The second, impose observation restrictions on human territorial expansion, pending a psychological and sociological review, timeline undetermined. The third, refer the matter to the Ethics and Species Relations Committee for formal study. Reconvene in 6 months with recommendations. Rensalath read all 3, asked for the floor to open. The faction that favored the third motion spoke first. They said, "We do not yet understand what happened this morning. We do not have sufficient data on human military capacity, human political structure, or human intentions. 6 months of study was not excessive caution. It was due diligence. The Council had made errors before, by moving too quickly. The Ethics Committee existed for exactly this kind of situation. They were not wrong. The faction that favored the second motion, the observation restrictions, spoke next. They said we watched a Category 3 emergent species defeat a 6th century unbeaten military power in 5 hours. Whatever we thought we knew about human capacity when we filed that intake form 18 months ago is no longer accurate. The Council had an obligation to understand the scale of what it had invited into its membership before the implications of that invitation became impossible to manage. They were not wrong either. The faction that favored the first motion, full membership, argued that humanity had done nothing that required restriction. They had fought a war that had been declared against them. They had won. That was not a reason to impose conditions. The very suggestion that a species should be penalized for defending itself effectively revealed, if anything, a problem with the instincts of the people making the suggestion, rather than with humanity. The chamber argued. It argued for 40 minutes. Sarath Vel said nothing during this time. She had been in enough sessions to know when argument was producing thought and when it was producing noise, and she had learned over 400 years to wait for the moment when they switched. The argument in front of her was producing noise, not because the speakers were not intelligent, they were, but because they were all arguing from the same position. They were afraid, and they were trying to dress the fear in the language of governance. That was understandable. She was afraid too. She just had a different relationship with it. Preth spoke at 0743. He stood up, which the Morvani did not typically do in open session. The chamber went quiet. Not immediately, but in the way rooms go quiet when a voice enters that has a particular quality, and the body responds before the mind decides to. He said he had read 4 minutes of the Human Historical Archive. He said his species maintained a shared memory of 3,000 years of collective experience. He had personally felt what it was to survive the Kel famine. He had felt the long peace, the things that were passed down through 6 billion minds, like a river, always moving, always present. He said that in 3,000 years, nothing he had felt through the shared memory had been outside a category he already possessed. Until this morning. He said, I read 4 minutes of human history, and I have been unable to place it in any category I have. Not because it is alien, because it is too familiar. Because it is what we would all be if we had spent 10,000 years with no one to fight but ourselves. He voted for full membership. He sat down. The vote was called at 0751. The result was a tie. 20 in favor of full membership. 20 in favor of the Ethics Committee referral. 1 abstention. The Beleth delegate, who had been the quietest person in the room all morning, and who, when asked to vote, had simply said that his people had a different relationship with the Vreth and with this question than perhaps was obvious, and he needed more time. Nobody pressed him. A tied vote was, under council rules, held open for a period of deliberation before a deciding procedure was invoked. The period was 30 minutes. Anyone who wished to speak before the period elapsed could do so. 28 minutes passed. Nobody spoke. Sarath Vel stood up at the 29th minute. She did not stand up often in open session. She filed formal testimony perhaps twice a year. More often than some, far less than others. When she stood, the room noticed. The room had been noticing her since this morning, watching her sit still and not pick up her water, and approve Preth's emergency session request in 4 seconds flat. They had been building a picture of what she knew and when she had known it, the way you build a picture of a storm from the behavior of things that feel it before you see it. She said she had flagged the Vreth observation rights clause before the first shot was fired. She said she had known within the first hour of engagement data what was happening. She said she had spent the last 4 hours watching. Not the war, the chamber. She said, I watched you reach for your frameworks, your forms, your categories. I watched the aid look for a capitulation form that does not exist, because no one who designed it needed to plan for 5 hours. I watched us argue this morning about whether humanity is dangerous, as though the question of danger is the one that matters. As though any wall we built would hold. She paused. We built this council to survive contact with things we had not anticipated. That was why 41 species agreed to sit in the same room and share the same governance structure. Because we believed that meeting the unknown together was better than meeting it alone. She looked at the chamber. This morning, the unknown called us first, filed the correct paperwork, won a 6th century war before breakfast. The question before us is not whether humanity is dangerous. Every species in this room is dangerous. The Vreth were dangerous. We invited the Vreth to our table. She cast her vote. Full membership. The deciding vote passed at 0802 Standard Time, 21-20. The formal notification was drafted, reviewed, and transmitted to the Human Government's Council Liaison Office at 0831. Standard processing time would have been 72 hours. The presiding officer authorized an expedited transmission. It arrived at the Human Command Station at 0847. Admiral Yara Solis received it personally. Her response to the Council arrived 14 minutes later. The translation AI processed it in under a second. No confidence rating needed. 4 words. Took you long enough. The chamber received the response at 0902. Sereth Fell read it. She read it again. And then, 412 years old, in a room full of 41 species and 6 centuries of accumulated governance protocol, in the quiet aftermath of the strangest morning she had sat through in a very long career, she did something that the Council's own archival cameras recorded, and that 3 different historians would later debate the significance of. She picked up her water, she drank it, and for just a moment, very briefly, in the small private way of someone who has spent 400 years learning to be careful about what they let their face say in public, she smiled. The session was adjourned at 0904. Outside the chamber window, the unnamed star system turned in the dark, the way it always had, the way it always would. Everything. Except now, somewhere in the galaxy, a species that had been called promising for 18 months was heading to a seat at a table that would never quite be the same table again. And they already knew it. They had known it before the forms were filed. That, in the end, was perhaps the only thing that should not have surprised anyone.